The Mitsubishi A6M2B Zero was a machine born out of contradiction. Introduced in the late 1930s, its agility, acceleration, and extraordinary range made it the symbol of Japanese aerial superiority. But beneath its flawless flight profile was a chilling vulnerability. It had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no structural safeguards for its pilot. In the early months of the Pacific War, this wasn't considered a flaw. It was a philosophy. Japan's leading engineers, particularly Jiro Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi, believed survival meant never getting hit. Every ounce of weight saved was an ounce of maneuverability gained, and in the dogfights over China and the Philippines, it worked. American and Allied aircraft were helpless, but as war evolved and adversaries adapted, the cost of fragility mounted. The Zero was being outpaced, outlasted, and outgunned. By 1942, the question emerged not just in design bureaus, but on the bloodied decks of aircraft carriers. What if survivability was prioritized instead? What if the Zero had armor? In an alternate timeline, this question isn't rhetorical. By late 1941, engineers at the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal begin working on a revised Zero prototype, the A6M2B Kai. The core structure remains unchanged, but modifications are radical by Japanese standards. A 12.7mm steel plate is installed behind the pilot's seat, weighing 60 kg. Additional armor plating, 30 kg, shields the Nakajima Seiki engine. Most critically, 120 kg of material is allocated for self-sealing fuel tanks, drastically reducing the risk of fire upon being hit. These aren't Western standards by any means. American aircraft often bore twice this protection. But in the context of the feather, light Zero, this was monumental. The resulting weight increase of 200 kg begins reshaping the aircraft's identity. Flight tests immediately show a drop in max speed from 533 km to 503 km. Range decreases from 3 to 100 km to 500 km. Dogfighting ability. Once the Zero's divine attribute is compromised. Yet, for the first time, pilots have a fighting chance of surviving hits. The cost of armor isn't just measured in performance. It's measured in doctrine, pride, and vision. Japanese aviation doctrine had always diverged from Western theory, while the Americans and British leaned on brute strength and survivability. Tanks of steel, thick cockpits, and robust redundancy. The Japanese bet everything on offense. Theirs was a nation of scarce resources and impossible distances. The Imperial Navy needed aircraft that could strike hard, fast, and far. Every screw, every bolt on the Zero was engineered to the edge of what physics would allow. Lightweight duralumin alloys replaced heavier alternatives. Even the Zero's landing gear was stripped to its minimum tolerances. Pilots trained to use agility as both sword and shield. And in combat, this approach seemed vindicated. Over the skies of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, Zeros danced like ghosts. American fighters couldn't match their turning radius or reach. But that edge was always temporary. By mid-1942, American pilots began adjusting their tactics. Rather than turn with the Zero, they dove, fired, and fled, exploiting the Zero's soft belly and lack of armor. Thus, the obsession with lightness had built a blade with no handle, lethal, but easily broken. In the revised A6M2B Kai, theoretical simulations begin to highlight serious consequences. Engineers observe a widening of the turn radius, from 90 to 110 meters. This increase, while seemingly small, has enormous implications in close combat. The Zero can no longer get inside a Wildcat's turning circle with ease. Climb rate is also affected, reduced from 8.5 ms to 7.5 ms. In battle, this means it takes longer to intercept enemy dive bombers, and worse, makes the Zero more vulnerable during dogfight transitions. Speed, a key factor in both attack and disengagement, suffers. A drop of 30 km can mean the difference between catching an enemy or being outrun. For an aircraft that once relied on overwhelming speed and control to dominate the Pacific skies, these changes dull its claws. But survivability metrics rise. Simulated engagements suggest that the probability of surviving a 0.50 caliber burst rises from just 5% to 45%, against the brutal odds faced by Japanese pilots in the latter half of the war. This is no small shift. But at what cost? With the rollout of the A6M2B Kai across two front line carrier groups, Shokaku and Zukaku, pilot training is altered accordingly. The new model demands a new approach to combat. Instead of engaging in tight loops and vertical spirals, pilots are encouraged to fight defensively, conserve energy, and rely on their newfound protection to survive hit and run tactics. This requires a radical change in mindset. Veteran pilots like Saburo Sakai express concern. The Zero was meant to be untouchable, not durable. Yet younger, less experienced pilots, who'd seen comrades shot down in flames, welcomed the armor. In simulated dogfights against captured wildcats, the differences are clear. While the new Zero cannot turn its American rival as reliably, it survives far more frequently. This gives pilots the opportunity to return, to learn, and to fight again. The loss rate per sortie begins to drop. However, tactical victories become harder to win. Survivability increases, but so does the number of incomplete kills, disengagements, and drawn-out duels. Japan's strategy of rapid aerial dominance begins to erode. May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea becomes the first major test of the A6M2B Kai. As Japanese carriers close in on Port Moresby, American scout planes detect the altered strike group configuration. The reduced range of the Oparmored Zeros has forced Japanese carriers to move 600 closer than in the original timeline. This proximity allows American forces to launch a coordinated counterstrike earlier than expected. As dauntless dive bombers descend upon Shokaku and Zuikaku, the Oparmored Zeros rise to intercept. It's immediately clear the aircraft perform differently. Slower to climb and less agile in their response, they fail to intercept the first wave in time. But when caught in head-on or rear-facing attacks, the upgraded armor proves its worth. Multiple Zeros absorb rounds that would have instantly killed their pilots in the standard model. Smoke trails from damaged aircraft now frequently lead back to the carriers, not into the sea. Despite this, the defense is weaker. American bombers land their hits. Shokaku suffers serious damage. Zuikaku's flight deck is scorched. Japanese commanders are forced to withdraw, their air group diminished but with more pilots alive than expected. The battle ends inconclusively. But the Zero's new nature is revealed. No longer the ghost of the skies, it is now merely a fighter, capable but compromised. The F-4F Wildcat had always been a puzzle for Zero pilots. It was heavier, less agile, and less glamorous, but it could take punishment, especially in a dive. American pilots quickly learned not to engage in turning fights. Instead, they performed boom and zoom attacks, diving from above, firing short bursts, then fleeing. Against the standard Zero, this was deadly. 50 caliber bursts could set the fuel tanks ablaze, but against the A6M2B Kai, this strategy proved less reliable. With self-sealing tanks and a steel plate shielding the pilot's back, Wildcat attacks often inflicted damage without kills. American kill ratios began to drop. Pilots noticed that Zeros weren't falling from the sky as easily as before. Dogfights became longer, messier, and more frustrating. But while the armor reduced vulnerability, it did not eliminate the Wildcat's overall edge. Now able to escape due to the Kai's reduced speed and climb rate, the Wildcat retained its survivability advantage. The once dreaded Zero now felt more like an even match rather than a superior predator. In combat, this subtle shift changed pilot morale. Americans grew bolder. Japanese pilots, though safer, lost some of the psychological edge the Zero once commanded. The skies became less about elegance and more about attrition. The redesign of the Zero also placed enormous strain on Japanese naval doctrine. Their entire carrier strategy hinged on range. With the A6M2B Kai's reduced flight distance, carriers now had to operate much closer to contested waters. This had a cascading effect. Closer proximity increased the likelihood of detection by American submarines and long-range patrol aircraft. Fuel consumption on naval supply lines surged. Refueling operations became riskier and more frequent. Escort vessels were stretched thinner as more resources were diverted to keep the carriers protected during forward operations. Moreover, the shorter legs of the new Zero meant fewer chances for surprise attacks. A cornerstone of Japanese offensive doctrine, surprise was the weapon that had brought devastation at Pearl Harbor. Now the Zero could no longer strike from the shadows. Operations became less about daring long-range assaults and more about holding contested zones. The loss of range wasn't just a metric. It was a strategic wound. Even as fewer pilots died in combat, the larger goals of fleet mobility and long-distance strikes began to crumble. The armor had kept men alive, but it was starting to strangle the Imperial Navy's wings. As the war ground into late 1942, the consequences of the Kai's design became more visible. Battles became longer. Kill ratios leveled out. More planes returned damaged rather than destroyed. On the surface, this seemed like progress. But Japan, unlike the United States, lacked the industrial capacity to maintain prolonged attrition. American factories churned out aircraft at a staggering pace, dozens a day. Japan struggled to maintain even a quarter of that output. Every damaged Zero required skilled labor and rare materials to restore. The aluminum alloys used in the Kai's airframe were becoming harder to procure due to Allied blockades. Worse, even though pilots now survived initial bursts, they were returning with injuries. Shrapnel wounds, concussions, burns, putting further strain on limited medical resources. Meanwhile, American pilots who bailed out were recovered, healed, and redeployed. Japan had improved survivability, but it had entered a war of attrition it could not win. The armor saved lives, but it couldn't create them. And with each passing month, the skies became a grinding machine where every advantage melted under the weight of industrial imbalance. Among Japanese pilots, opinions were deeply divided about the Kai variant. Veterans who had flown in China and early Pacific campaigns lamented the change. The Zero was meant to embody the samurai spirit, swift, precise, and lethal. They believed survivability was a coward's compromise. Armor to them dulled the blade, but younger pilots, many of whom had watched their classmates perish in flames, felt differently. The Kai was a lifeline. Instructors at flight schools noted a shift in attitude. Cadets trained harder, knowing they had a better chance of returning from combat. Yet, paradoxically, this new mindset also bred caution. Aggression declined. Pilots became more hesitant in the air, more likely to disengage than press an advantage. The once feared zeal of the Zero pilot began to erode. American interceptors sensed this. Reports from Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands mention more Zeros turning away from combat than in early 1942. The Kai gave pilots time, but it may have taken away their edge. Spirit, after all, was as much a part of war as steel. The effects of the op-armored Zero became particularly evident during the grueling Solomon Islands campaign. Unlike earlier naval engagements, the fighting here was a prolonged, bloody grind. Airfields taken and retaken, convoys ambushed, and constant duels between aircraft in a sky perpetually filled with smoke. The Kai's reduced range meant that Japanese air support could no longer reach the front lines from Rabaul without mid-point staging, leading to the rushed construction of forward airstrips like Balale and Bin. These hastily built bases were exposed, poorly supplied, and vulnerable to American bombardment. Every flight sortie risked the loss of fuel, airframes, or ground crew. Yet the Kai proved to be a paradox. It saved more pilots who landed on these crude strips. Many were evacuated, patched up, and flew again. But the added armor also meant fewer Zeros made it to the combat zone with full payloads or maximum speed. American fighters, particularly the F-4F and the emerging F-6F Hellcat, began to exploit this. Slower Kai Zeros were picked off before even reaching the fight. In multiple operations, Japanese raids failed to achieve air superiority. Not because of cowardice, but because the new Zeros simply couldn't arrive in time or numbers. A plane that once extended Japan's reach now tethered it to the ground. October 1942. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands becomes another turning point for the Zero's evolution. With Shokaku still under repair, Zuikaku takes center stage as the flagship of the Japanese carrier force. This time, dozens of A6M2B Kai Zeros are deployed in a combat air patrol screen to defend the fleet. When waves of American torpedo bombers and dive bombers descend, the Zeros scramble to meet them. The Kai model, slower to climb and turn, still manages to intercept thanks to earlier detection. This time, more attacking aircraft are downed, But not enough. American SBD Dauntless bombers strike Zuikaku with brutal precision. One bomb punches through the flight deck, igniting stored fuel below. Though the Zeros fought bravely, their inability to completely control the sky led to disaster. After the battle, surviving pilots reflect they are alive, yes, but their carrier is sinking. Engineers had created a fighter that preserved men, but not missions. Japan's elite pilots were returning to bases without ships to land on. The cost of protection had manifested not just in aircraft performance, but in the survivability of the entire fleet structure. Without mobility, Japan's entire naval doctrine began to collapse. While Japan was modifying the Zero for defense, America was evolving its entire aviation ecosystem. The introduction of the F-6F Hellcat and later the F-4U Corsair represented a leap in design philosophy. These fighters combined armor, firepower, range, everything the Kai struggled to balance. By early 1943, American pilots no longer feared the Zero, whether standard or modified. New tactics, radar-guided interception, and improved communication coordination gave U.S. squadrons dominance in the air. The Kai, once a feared silhouette on the horizon, was now a known quantity. Its climb rate and top speed were factored into every engagement plan. American bombers adjusted formation altitudes. Escort fighters anticipated defensive patterns. The initial unpredictability and fear factor of the Zero had evaporated. This shift wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. American pilots approached fights with calm precision, while Japanese flyers, despite their armor, felt increasing desperation. The up-armored Zero had been a bold step toward parity, but the world of aviation had already moved ahead. One of the most haunting ironies of the A6M2B Kai's story is that all its transformation, hundreds of kilograms of armor, months of redesign, thousands of man-hours, was often defeated by a single well-placed bullet. The armor plate saved lives from rear attacks, yes, but the Zero's design still lacked redundancy. A hit to the wing spar could shatter lift. A puncture to the oil line still caused engine failure. In many cases, pilots survived the initial burst, only to glide hopelessly into the sea, radioing final messages. And in the Pacific, even survival didn't guarantee rescue. American ships controlled more and more of the ocean, making recovery impossible. The Zero, whether armored or not, was still built on a fragile skeleton. Engineers had added protection, but the fundamental contradiction remained. You could not make a sword into a shield without losing its edge. And as Japan began retreating across the Pacific, the skies no longer rewarded bravery alone. They demanded resilience, numbers, and systemic strength. Qualities Japan, despite all its heroism, was running out of. By 1944, the A6M2B Kai was no longer cutting edge. Faster American jets were appearing. Radar was reshaping combat, and Japan had begun experimenting with desperate measures. Rocket planes, kamikaze units, and last-ditch interceptors. The Kai Zeros continued flying, some converted into trainer aircraft, others sent on defensive missions. Their pilots, many veterans by now, viewed them with bittersweet pride. The modifications had not saved Japan, but they had saved lives. For every pilot who bailed out and was rescued, for every airman who crashed, landed, and returned, the armor had meant another day to fight or survive. Historians would later debate the wisdom of the change. Strategically, it may have accelerated Japan's decline by weakening its doctrine of long-range aggression. Tactically, it extended the life of its air force by months. Philosophically, it marked a shift from invincible offense to grim endurance. The A6M2B Kai remains a monument to a doomed compromise, the hope that protection could coexist with precision and that survival might still mean victory. Years after the war, many surviving Japanese pilots who flew the A6M2B Kai reflected on the aircraft not just as a machine, but as a symbol of what was lost and what was learned. In memoirs and interviews, their sentiments were complex. Some remembered the Kai with gratitude. It had shielded them long enough to escape death on missions that would have otherwise been fatal. Others felt a lingering sadness. They missed the purity of the original Zero, its effortless control and ghost-like precision. One veteran, a flight leader at Guadalcanal, wrote, The Kai protected my body, but not my soul. The spirit of the Zero was never meant to survive by compromise. The war had forced Japan's finest aviators to confront a sobering truth. Even the most revered design must bend to the realities of modern combat. The Zero was no longer an untouchable blade. It was a worn sword, reforged to endure instead of conquer. And in that transformation, something noble had been lost. The memories of those who flew it serve as testimony to both the brilliance and the burden of its evolution. While the Kai attempted to bridge the tactical gap in the skies, it could not compensate for the larger industrial disparity between Japan and the United States. For every Zero repaired, the Americans built 5 new Hellcats. For every Japanese pilot saved, the Americans trained 10. Armor gave the Zero pilots a second chance, but Japan had no infrastructure to capitalize on those survivals. Spare parts were rare. Aircraft factories were bombed. Training programs were rushed. Meanwhile, the U.S. deployed increasingly advanced aircraft carriers, radar systems, and strategic bombers with global reach. The Kai's reduced range meant that Japan was always reacting, never initiating. And as the front lines moved closer to the Japanese mainland, the once symbolic Zero became a desperate defender, not a feared attacker. Despite brilliant modifications, tactical innovations, and courageous flyers, the war was now being decided in steel mills, oil refineries, and shipyards far beyond Japan's reach. No matter how advanced the fighter, it could not outfly an empire of machines. By mid-1944, many A6M2B Kai Zeros found themselves assigned to desperate final missions: defensive sorties over the Philippines, escort duties for crumbling convoys, and eventually kamikaze attacks. Some pilots refused to use their armored aircraft for suicide missions, believing the upgrades were meant for survival, not sacrifice. Others had no choice. The steel plating and fuel-resistant tanks delayed ignition just long enough to reach targets. But even that protection became ironic in the context of kamikaze missions. The Kai's strength, preservation, was now being repurposed for certain death. One squadron leader at late wrote in his logbook, before launching his final mission, "This Zero was built to protect me. But today, I protect the homeland." In these missions, the armored Zeros often flew alone or in small groups, often with missing parts and patchwork repairs. They had outlived their time, yet remained loyal to duty. Their final flights were not about victory, but about bearing witness to a war they could no longer change. Each impact into a ship, each failed return, marked the end of the Kai's dream. In post-war Japan, the memory of the A6M2B Kai became a subject of debate among engineers, historians, and military analysts. Some argued that had the Kai been developed earlier, before Pearl Harbor, it could have dramatically changed the tempo of American losses and prolonged the Japanese strategic edge. Others countered that no matter how early it arrived, the Kai could not have reversed the momentum of a nation outmatched in resources and production. Yet the mere act of modification had profound historical meaning. It showed that even the most rigid philosophies, like Japan's cult of lightness, could be questioned under pressure. In engineering schools, the Kai became a case study of compromise and adaptation. At the Yokosuka Naval Technical Arsenal, a preserved prototype stood as a reminder not of what won the war, but what might have if the world had been shaped differently. It was a lesson in balance, between idealism and realism, brilliance and humility. And for generations of post-war thinkers, the Kai was not just a relic, it was a warning. The story of the A6M2B Kai is not one of triumph or failure, but of transformation. It is a tale of what happens when engineering genius meets the brutal logic of total war. The original Zero was unmatched in its prime, a perfect blend of flight, freedom, and lethality, but perfection is fragile. The Kai's armor gave its pilots hope, time, and sometimes life, yet it also erased the very traits that made the Zero the master of the skies. In its final form, the Zero became something more human, flawed, heavier, grounded. It reflected the shifting identity of an empire facing limits. And while the aircraft itself is gone, buried in coral reefs and jungle ruins, its story remains. Not in speed records or kill counts, but in the decisions made by engineers under siege, pilots facing impossible odds, and a nation wrestling with the cost of compromise. The Zero that might have been was never meant to save Japan. But it taught the world something deeper. Even legends must change, or be left behind.